Okay, hello, this is Roger. I'm back. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I was diagnosed because this is interesting and it's something that might be helpful to you. It was April of 2022. Not looking for anything, just happened to be reading a book on longevity by Pete Diamandis, and he had a chapter in there about cancer, which in fact, I saved that chapter. I skipped ahead and came back and read that chapter last because it was the last thing in the world I think I needed to know about. And in it, he mentioned liquid biopsies, which are blood tests that can detect cancer, which I thought was really fascinating because I'd heard about this for many years and I'd heard that companies were working on this, and every year at my annual physical I'd ask my doctor about it and they would deny that any such thing existed or that it worked or that I needed it because I didn't have any symptoms. So, you know, why would you want that? And no, we're not going to order that for you. Well, here I read about it. Now there's a company that figured out a way to offer this to the public, even though it is not FDA approved, and it's being offered under an exemption from FDA because it's being used for testing. That's a whole nother episode. Anyhow, it took a while because I did take this back to my doctors, two of them, and tried to get them to prescribe it for me because you do need a doctor's order to get these tests, and they wouldn't do it. So the gallery company, Grail company, found me a telemedicine doctor who was able to order the test on my behalf. It's a gallery blood test, and through that test they found a signal for cancer and suggested that I get additional testing. I went in the next day with a company called Prenuvo to get an MRI because that's about all I could do. I can't order my own CT scan, for example, or a PET scan, which is all stuff that the doctor said I should do at Gallery. So I was able to order my own MRI. And fortunately, Prenuvo is very close to where I live, so I was able to go in at 6 o'clock next morning and I got the scan. And about a week later, they called me up and said they'd found a mass on my pancreas and I really needed to get in and get a CT scan and a full, complete workup. Now, I went back to my doctors with all of this information and I got pushback on both of these tests. Like, you have no symptoms, this is very aggressive, you're overreacting. It was really sort of disappointing that they were not sharing my sense of urgency. But I had enough urgency for both of us, and I did manage to get in front of an oncology team. And once an oncology team saw these results, everything changed. Then it was a four-alarm fire. And I did get in eventually, very soon after, middle of July, probably within a week of or 10 days of the Prenuvo. I was able to get admitted and get a CT scan and a biopsy. Now, the biopsy is how they find, well, for me, that's how they make the initial diagnosis. And it's what they call an endoscopic biopsy. It's just like it sounds. They put a little camera and a fine needle, down into your stomach, and it basically pierces the tumor, and it takes a sample that can be taken into a lab and tested. And that's what we did. We did that on top of a CT scan. And the test that they did, where I had my procedure at Stanford, is called a STAMP report. That's Sequence Topology Assembly for Multiplex Profiling, but STAMP, okay? And it basically tells you what the mutations are. Now, interestingly, where I had my treatment, that was just standard operating procedure, but it's not everywhere, and not everybody gets this. And patients really need to know that, look, we need to find out what the mutations are. It's super important, no matter which cancer, but especially for pancreatic. Now, most pancreatic cancers have what they call a KRAS mutation. Oddly enough, I did not. So good news, I don't have KRAS mutation. Bad news, I had SMAD4 and also an ALK fusion. So kind of, I guess, frying pan into the fire. So I didn't have the KRAS, but I did have the ALK. I've found out later through additional, and that's very important because there are targeted therapies for those mutations. Now, as I'll talk about later, I refused those therapies. I turned them down, but they're out there. And it's good to know we've got that in our back pocket if I ever change my mind. I wouldn't know that without this sort of sequencing and understanding which mutations I have. Now, on top of the SNAP report, since that time, I was able to find a lot of other reports that give a lot of other information, because any of these reports are going to be only so useful because a tumor especially is going to be very heterogenic. It's going to have a lot of diversity and differences depending on which cells you get. So on top of that report, I also got reports. PanCan put me in touch with a company called Tempus. They have a Know Your Tumor program, and Tempus did their own sequencing, which was not only the DNA mutations, but the RNA mutations. And believe it or not, they're different because, you know, if it's not being expressed, it's not going to show up in a DNA report. And the DNA did not find the ELF, the RNA did. Go figure. Similarly, I got a report from a company called Boston Gene, which also gave me quite a lot of information about the tumor. A lot of information that became very important later. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about tumor environment, but those reports are really important, and I'm very impressed with Boston Genes. On top of that, not only was I testing for the mutations, but also testing for the proteins that the cancer cell is expressing on the surface, and that's through a process called proteomics. And through cancerpatientlab.org, I was put in touch with a company called mProbe, which did a proteomics report. And that came up with a whole new set of information that was really interesting. Remember that KRAS mutation that I'm so lucky not to have? Well, it turns out I have a KRAS protein expression, even though there's no KRAS mutation. And nobody can really explain that to me. There's one study out there that I found that says that's worse than having the mutation, but I don't know. At least we know that, you know, the protein's there. By the way, in my case, I will tell you that every one of these reports, they're all a little bit different. They all found something different. They all had a little different spin. They provided different information, but every one of them had poor prognosis stamped on them in big, bold letters. So I know what that means. You don't have to be a scientist to figure that out. And it's actually probably a good thing because it certainly did keep my mind focused on the fact that this was something that had to be dealt with beyond standard of care. So that was the diagnosis. It was through the biopsy, it was through the CT scan, and join me for the next session. I'll tell you about the treatments that I started immediately after that.